you introduce yourself?
I'm Lloyd Slaght. I was in the United States Air Force during the Korean War from 1951 to 1955. I had completed 2 years of college at Graceland College, Lamoni, Iowa, when the draft was catching up with me, as it did all young men back in 1951. So I decided to enlist in the Air Force for 4 years rather than to be drafted into the Army for 2 years and not know what I would be doing. I was assigned to Sampson Air Force Base in Geneva, New York for basic training. One of the few Air Force men that I've talked to that wasn't sent to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. Just before Christmas of '51, I had completed basic training and was sent to Northeast Missouri State Teachers College at Kirksville, Missouri for a 3-month office course, mostly clerk typist work learning. Then I was assigned to McCord Air Force Base in Tacoma, Washington at 1705th Air Transport Group headquarters. This headquarters had C-124 Globemasters, which were the largest transport plane that the Air Force had at that time. I started in there in that spring, was sent then to the University of Denver for a 2-month course on ground safety and returned back that late summer to McCord Air Force Base, and I served the rest of my time there at McCord at the headquarters of the 1705th Air Transport Group. The C-124s were used to transport the large equipment such as tanks, bulldozers, wheeled vehicles of the Army that were too large to fit in any other transports at that time. So our group took supplies to Tokyo, to Honolulu, up to Thule, Greenland, Keflavik, Iceland, and anywhere else in the world, and in addition to supporting the supplies to Korea. In 1953, there was an accident transporting service people back from Korea to Japan, and that was the worst aviation accident at that time in the military. The second worst accident, or most people that were killed, were on a plane that left Moses Lake, Washington on December 20th of 1952 on what was called Operation Sleigh Ride, taking military people home for Christmas. I was scheduled to be on that plane, but because of bad weather, I could not get across the mountains from Tacoma over to Moses Lake the night before, and was preserved from having been on that plane, which crashed on takeoff. The experience I had at the 1705th Air Transport Group was very enjoyable. I did get married in 1953 to Joanne Fenn from Iowa, and we spent our last 2 years married at McCord Air Force Base. I was in during the years that the C-124 was newly built and delivered to the Air Force. I believe they had about 440 of them that they bought during the time from 1950 to 1955. So I was fortunate to be in the group out of McCord that took some of the early C-124s and used them to support the military effort around the world. I did, as a side, I did make one inspection trip up to Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. When I got out of the service in 1955, I received a $300 extra pay for having been overseas. This was before Alaska became a state, so I'm old enough to say I was overseas in Alaska when it was not a state. Do you have any questions? Okay. The two problems that we worked on with the C-124s was that they did have problems with their engines and did have problems with anti-icing equipment. So our maintenance people had to work extensively on correcting those problems, and those were the two factors that entered into the two major accidents that happened during the time that I was in the C-124 outfit. This was interesting in that it was before the time of jet engines. The plane that replaced the C-124 as the large supply and troop carrier for the Air Force after C-124 had jet engines. So we had one of the last four-engine planes that had the Pratt & Whitney 4,300 engines, or about 3,800 horsepower. These planes would go about 4,000 miles without refueling. So it was an amazing plane at that time that has now been, of course, replaced by much more modern equipment. At that time, one interesting thing was that because our pilots had to be concerned about engine failures, halfway to Hawaii was a place called the spot of no return. The pilots had to make up their mind when they were halfway to Hawaii. If the engines were all running good, everything sounded fine, they would continue. If there was any problem, they'd turn around and go back to California. Now you never even think about that. I've made several trips to Hawaii where I have a daughter that retired from the Navy as a Navy commander. She lives in Hawaii. My wife and I go over and visit her, and you get on a jet airliner now and you never hear of an engine failure. But that's something that we had to be concerned about when I was with the C-124 unit. That's all I have right now. Crossing my legs show or anything like that? No. Okay. Another interesting thing was that I was in the Air Force during a transition period when the Air Force did not know what ranks they wanted to have. When I started out after basic training and went to the first training school at Northeast Missouri State Teachers College, I was promoted to corporal at the end of that course because I was in the top 5 of the class. And later, then I was changed to an airman first class because the Air Force had started changing from the old PFC corporal sergeant to what they called airman basic, airman second class, airman first class. But then in 1954, they changed back to sergeant, so I was a staff sergeant in the group headquarters for my last year and a half. In 1953, Joanne and I got married, and we had our first son born on the base. Actually, I believe he was born at Fort Lewis, Washington. there was a road that connected McChord Air Force Base to Fort Lewis, Washington, which many people are familiar with because it's a basic military base for the Army on the West Coast. So she decided to work before the son came and worked in the purchasing department. I think some of the things she had to purchase were the fruitcakes for Christmas for the troops, but she purchased all kinds of supplies for our airplanes, C-124s, and all of the support things, in addition to purchasing the food. My position in the group headquarters was extensive office work. Our commander, who was a full colonel, was a command pilot, and so he had to make these trips as a command pilot, and he would usually have two pilots at least with him so that they could relieve each other on the long flights. Our adjutant was a major who happened to be the best navigator around, so our commander always took the best navigator with him, which left the headquarters void of officers for a period of time, and so I, by default, sort of ran the office while he was gone. I did have a secret clearance. I would go over and get the messages from the message center, cut the orders, and then stay around the office and hold down the fort while they were gone. We did have one master sergeant who, if you're familiar with military units, usually is the NCOIC in charge when the officers are gone. But our master sergeant had about 28 out of his 30 years in, and had been elected president of the NCO Club, Non-Commissioned Officers Club, and so he elected to spend his time over there, and they decided that that was fine and for me to stay and do what was normally a first sergeant's duties. I made an inspection trip up to Elmendorf Air Force Base, Alaska, and found out that the sun goes down about midnight and comes up at 3 o'clock. I had a friend who had enlisted in the Air Force about the same time I did, who was in the military police up there, so he took me out bear hunting at midnight. Luckily, we didn't find any bear, but his wife, he had had a bear caught, and his wife did cook that for us. I think she cooked it, the bear roast for about 24 hours before we ate it, but it was what they lived on. He subsequently stayed up there and homesteaded. At that time, Anchorage had some paved roads downtown, but when you got out just a couple of miles, it was mud roads, and people could homestead, build a cabin, and that's what he and his wife did, and stayed up there and loved it. Our colonel, being an aircraft commander, I believe was also the person who did custom clearance when they got back into the United States from trips overseas. I remember one trip, he took requests for bicycles and brought back quite a few Christmas toys for the other people in our unit from Japan, and cleared the customs himself, I believe, but don't hold me to that. But they were wonderful people that I worked with there, every one of them.
Do you ever go to reunions, or do you have reunions?
No, our outfit never did have reunions. At the time I completed my service on August 30th of 1955, I was placed in the reserve for 4 years, and the records were sent to Denver, Colorado Record Center. I was offered a position to go to Washington, D.C. with the unit that transports the President of the United States with Air Force One. At that time, I wasn't smart enough to know how good a deal that was, what a wonderful experience that would have been with President Eisenhower, who had come in by that time. I was just anxious to get out and get back to school. I went to the University of Michigan then and completed my bachelor's degree in business administration. But as I look back on it, it would have been a wonderful experience to go with President Eisenhower. When I first went in, President Truman was president, and he was the one that had answered the United Nations call to send troops and supplies over to Korea to help the United Nations. And subsequently, President Eisenhower was in when I left. When I did make a trip through the Denver airport, I did see I saw Dwight D. Eisenhower there in the Denver airport before he was president, when he was going to be running for president. Also, when I was in line to buy some gum, there was a beautiful blonde in front of me that I couldn't help noticing, and when it got my turn to come up to the cashier said, "Do you know who that was just ahead of you who was flying out to the West Coast?" And I said, "No," and she said, "That was Doris Day." So I got to be right behind Doris Day in the line buying candy bars or gum, in addition to seeing Dwight D. Eisenhower. While I was at McCord, I did get to see the Andrews sisters. I met Joni James. She came to our NCO club one evening, and was a singer that put on a program for the servicemen, and did get to sit with her and talk to Joni James after her presentation. So I did have some interesting experiences while in the Air Force.
Do you think you being in the Navy influenced your daughter or perhaps your other children also from
No.
going into the Navy?
No, see, I was in the Air Force,
Oh, I'm sorry.
but my daughter went into the Navy.
That's right.
She had graduated from college, and about the only thing she could get offered was secretarial work, and she thought that she wanted to do something else, so a Navy recruiter talked to her, took her for an airplane ride, and one of the Navy trainers sold her on it, and so she went through the program that is shown on the movie An Officer and a Gentleman. She went on that program, one of the first females that went through aviation officer candidate school at Jacksonville, Florida. After she graduated from that, they weren't letting women fly yet, and so she went into intelligence, went to intelligence school in Denver, and then returned to the Jacksonville. Actually, she took her training at Pensacola and then went back to Jacksonville in a P3 unit, which was an anti-submarine unit. She kept working her way up in the Navy. She had assignments in Greece, in Italy, in Spain. She was assigned as the Navy liaison officer to SAC headquarters up in Omaha at Strategic Air Command, and then was sent to Hawaii, where she was in intelligence at the Joint Command, and finished up as an intelligence officer in charge of certain areas. one of the areas that she was heavily involved in was when our Navy P-3 plane was flying off the coast of China, and one of the Chinese fighter pilots clipped his propeller, or clipped his tail on the propeller of our P-3, and he went down, and our P-3 had to land on the China island. A few years ago, she was involved in all of that decoding what had happened and sending her report to Washington. So she's had some wonderful Navy experiences in intelligence work too, and has done a lot of good for our country during that time that she was in.
I'm sorry, I know you were the first statement, when you had the security class in the office you worked in,
Yes.
have those papers by now been open to public view?
I imagine they would be, because it's been 50 years now. So they should be. Most of those were giving us orders where to send the plane. I don't think I mentioned that we were building the DEW line at that time, the Distant Early Warning Line. It was a joint project with Canada to build a line across the northern borders. That was when there was still a Cold War with Russia, and to prevent attacks from coming over from the north, Canada and the United States had signed a joint agreement, and they were building what was called the Distant Early Warning Line, or I believe it was under NORAD, and our planes were taking supplies up to Thule, Greenland, and Keflavik, Iceland, taking supplies up through Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage, up to Nome and ADAC. Some of the Navy planes that went through our unit went up there. So some of those papers were secret orders for taking supplies up to that DEW line.
When you would travel like that, how long were you gone?
Not extensively. Long enough to make inspection trips of our units.
Thank you, Lloyd, for coming and sharing your story with us.
You're certainly welcome.